Welcome to Season 2 of the PreOccupation podcast. This season explores the mid to late 19th century of Ottoman Palestine, and it takes us on a journey with stops in Istanbul, Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and, of course, everywhere in Palestine. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast, first of all, thank you. You can do so by following the link in the episode description. You can also find me on Instagram at PreOccupationPod. Otherwise, enjoy.
Jerusalem has long been the focal point of the still unsolved problem of Palestine.
There is no Palestine, no Palestinians. There never was, there never will be.
فلسطيني أنا اسمي فلسطيني.
So welcome back, everyone, to the PreOccupation podcast. I'm so honored to have Dr. Usamma Makdisi with us. I benefited greatly from his book, The Age of Coexistence, The Ecumenical Frame and the Making of the Modern Arab World. And out of order, I am currently reading, I'm about 3/4 through one of the best titled books I've ever seen, which is Artillery of Heaven, which you actually wrote before the Age of Coexistence. Dr. Makdisi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Would you care to take a moment to briefly introduce yourself, to introduce your work? I like to allow the scholars to introduce themselves rather than doing it myself. So to whatever extent that you'd like to, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Well, obviously, I'm a professor of history. I come from the Mashriq, from Lebanon. My mother is Palestinian. My father is Lebanese. I grew up in Beirut during the civil war there, and that had a profound impact on me, obviously, inevitably. And I've sort of pursued sort of the writing of modern Arab history with an eye to humanize and historicize the peoples of that world. Who have been consistently orientalized and demonized in the West. And so on the one hand, sort of I'm constantly responding to this persistent, ruthless Orientalism. And on the other hand, also responding to what I see, especially in the era we're living in now, sort of we can think of it as a new Arab dark age. The post US invasion of Iraq, of course, it actually predates the US invasion of Iraq. The sort of collapse of the Mashriq, the dissolution, of course, in one sense, it goes back to the end of the Nakba of 1948, but really, it's post 1967. It's also the Lebanese Civil War, the crushing of the Arab Spring, the crushing of emancipation throughout the region, and the sense of despair and self-loathing that people have in the region. Part of it, of course, is understandable because it is a desperate situation. On the other hand, there's also a profound, I think, disconnect between an extraordinary history, and not just a medieval or ancient history, but a modern history of coexistence that I think people cynically discount and dismiss because they are so desperate, I think. And again, I understand the despair, but I don't think that we should give in to, especially as scholars who are privileged to have the ability to write about this region. We should sort of so that's in a nutshell how I would introduce myself. Professor of history, an Arab American Educational Foundation Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University. At least for the it's my time at Rice is coming to a close, and I'm moving very soon to a new institution.
So that's what gets you out of bed in the morning.
Well, what gets me out of bed in the morning is actually my family.
I actually should have said I have two young children, and there's a
Yeah.
possibility that there will be some banging on the door. So
Yeah. No worries. I understand completely. Yeah.
You mentioned the invasion of Iraq and the cultural despair that followed. And not too long ago, I was sitting down with my dad. Of course, I mean, the war in Iraq was probably the single most transformative experience for me as a teenager. And my dad and I were saying, can you believe that it's almost been 20 years? And I think the reason why it feels like just yesterday is because it never really felt like we were able to close that chapter, because it never felt like the war ended.
Correct, because the war doesn't end. Yeah, the war doesn't end for the people who live. I mean, the people who are impacted and have lived through this war, Iraqis first and foremost. In the case of the invasion of Iraq, the Americans can withdraw their troops, but and for most Americans, of course, Iraq is the past tense.
Right.
But for everyone who has any sort of intimate relationship to this part of the world, and to peoples in this part of the world, whether family or friends or anything, of course, it's an ongoing trauma.
I want to start by asking a quick question, I guess, about your first book of the two that I've read, which is Artillery of Heaven. And the general premise of the book is it's an introduction to the moment that American Puritan missionaries make landfall in the Levant, where they come in contact with, I guess the way that you describe it is a Christian orthodoxy that is not so defined by conquest and a sense of superiority, but resignation. And the tone of the book is so serious, but the content, were you to take the seriousness out, is almost like a Monty Python sketch of two people's speaking past each other. So tell me a little bit about what went into writing that. And I hope I haven't insulted it by comparing it to a Monty Python, but I guess you as the author understand what I mean when I say that.
Well, so long as you like Monty Python and appreciate Monty Python, that wouldn't have been the first choice for me to describe the book. But Terry Gilliam, of course, was someone who cared profoundly about history and the Crusades, I think. So I think it's the book obviously was about the case of As'ad al-Shadiq, who was the first. He's often described as the first martyr, which suggests that there are many other martyrs that followed him, but he was one of the first, if not the first, Arab Maronite Christians to convert to not so much American Puritanism, but as an American evangelical missionary Christianity. That was introduced by these missionaries of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, who went off. These were young men, basically, the Americans. They were young men. We would call them today zealots or enthusiasts. They were completely and utterly self-righteous. They were not imperialists in the sense that they didn't have an empire behind them as such. They came literally on their own. Initially, they arrived in the Ottoman Empire, which of course at the time was weaker than it had been in the 18th and 17th and 16th centuries, but it was still a powerful empire. And these people were basically completely what's the word, naive in a certain way, naive and enthusiastic and intolerant and bigoted and self-righteous, but also idealists. And they really wanted to convert the world. Not just, by the way, not just the Ottoman Empire or the Islamic world, but the entire world. Right. And they were completely sort of seized with this sort of fantasy of converting everybody everywhere. And so they arrive in a place that they knew nothing about, really, whose languages they knew nothing about, other than maybe a smattering of a few words here and there. But they certainly didn't know any Arabic at the time when they first arrived. And some of them were more sort of convinced of the second coming of Christ, the imminent second coming of Christ. Others less so. But the point is, they had these kinds of fantasies of what Christianity should be, and they completely discounted native Arab and Eastern Christianity, as well as Judaism, as well as Islam, of course. And so they arrived in this part of the world, and they were a complete sort of, like, it was a fiasco. in essence. And they came up against not just the Ottoman Empire and Muslims, but also, of course, Eastern Christian churches, who were alarmed by the arrival of people who were intent on overturning an entire way of life, basically.
I want to press at something that you said there, because
Sure.
unlike some of the missionaries that were coming out of places like France or Britain, who in some characterizations are really an extension of empire, right?
Yeah.
They were creating, in some cases, literally colonies.
Yeah.
The Americans were not. However, just to be clear, they did come with the protection of empire.
For sure. They came with it.
You do address that in the book. Like they came,
Yeah.
It was actually, it must have felt overwhelming because they had documentation of Russian, British, Catholic, and American cover, essentially diplomatic cover.
They had British diplomatic cover first and most importantly for them was British diplomatic cover, but they still didn't have. I mean, I think I would call them cultural imperialists in the U.S. context, where they were part and parcel of the destruction of native spirituality and religious forms and culture in the American context, in the settler colonial context. But when you transplant them to the Middle East or the Ottoman Empire, they were completely out of. They were coming up against extremely, I would say, a very powerful and still sort of hegemonic system that was not militarily subordinated to American imperialism. That's why I say it's important to be nuanced about this, because otherwise we say all missionaries are imperialist, and then we sort of lose any sense. Okay, well then then what's the point of studying anything? Right. You really need to figure out, okay, what makes these people different from others.
And actually, to your credit, you do humanize them very well. That's one of the things that I enjoy in the book, is that you get a depth to these missionaries that doesn't reduce them to a two-dimensional antagonist in the story of Ottoman resistance to imperialism.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, to shift gears to the content of your more current book, The Age of Coexistence, mm-hmm. You describe in some detail the ecumenical frame. And if I've understood it correctly, the ecumenical frame is essentially the Ottoman Mashriq's response to modernity. It is the response to the question, how can the Mashriq best navigate the clumsy and involuntary transition from empire to nation state? And so far as I can tell, this frame deals with two primary problems. One is, how do we define the us and them in this coming chapter of our existence? But the other is, what role will Islam play in public life? So can you walk us through, first of all, if I've understood this correctly, and why was this the pressing issue of the time?
Yeah, I mean, I would say sort of the ecumenical frame is my attempt to say that basically you could think of it as a modern culture of coexistence. So the idea is exactly as you're saying. On the one hand, I wouldn't say it's a response to modernity. I would say it's an interpretation. I mean, it's not, modernity is everywhere. It's universal at this point. And all cultures in all parts of the world are, including, of course, in the US and in Europe, they're grappling with this idea of how do you, where do we draw the boundaries between modern norms and modern ideas of citizenship, equality, religious diversity, and nationalism and sovereignty? How do we negotiate or balance these different imperatives? And so the ecumenical frame is the Mashriq, or the Ottoman Arab East's interpretation of these questions. In other words, it's the elaboration of a culture that says we are both Arab and Ottoman, we're multi-religious, and we can be modern. And then, of course, within this, there are different interpretations. Some are more religious, some are more secular, some are in between, some are 2/3 here, 1/3 here. It really honestly depends on the person, the location, the context. But the point is, there was a confidence in the Arab East and the elaboration of a new sense of being Arab, which was extraordinarily important, because it provided the opportunity within an Ottoman sovereign frame within the Ottoman sort of sovereignty, in other words, within one unified sort of political, at least in theory, political and territorial landscape, it provided the opportunity for Arabs to define what being Arab was in a modern multi-religious sense. In other words, you could be a Christian Arab, you could be a Muslim Arab, you could be a Jewish Arab, and there was no contradiction between these. But then, of course, it opens up a whole other set of questions, as you said. Okay, so then given that, where do you draw the line between Islam and the public sphere, or Islam and the state? And what exactly, those are one of the questions. Those were some of the questions. There were other questions. What about women's rights? What about the rights of minorities? What about the rights of non-Muslims, and so on and so forth? There were a million questions that were asked. But
also, then, who are the minorities?
And who are them? Exactly.
Right,
yeah.
Because in a world where the Muslim is the us and the non-Muslim is the them, well, okay, this was divided on some kind of sectarian boundary. But
the point is, it's important to understand it's not just the Muslim is us, because the whole point of the 19th century is that the Ottoman Empire is transitioning is being transformed, both because of its own agency and because of European pressure and imperialism, and because of Balkan nationalisms, and because of internal rebellions, and because of many other factors.
Okay.
Besides, the Ottoman Empire is transforming itself from being an empire of, the phrase that Karen Barkey uses is an empire of difference. In other words, a Muslim empire that ruled over Muslim and non-Muslim subjects, profound inequality, but yet multi-religious, multilinguistic, multi-ethnic. In sort of the Ottoman sense, how do you transform that into an empire of citizens, allegedly and nominally equal citizens, irrespective of the religious affiliation? So the whole question of who we are in the 19th century is up for debate.
Right.
And so the quote is redefining what it means to be Ottoman, what it means to be Arab, what it means to be Muslim, what it means to be Christian. And then everyone has, in a sense, a question of affiliation, secular affiliation. Are we Muslim first and foremost, or are we Ottoman first and foremost? Are we both? How are we compatriots with Christians? How are we Christian Arabs or Arab Christians, and so on and so forth? And
that last bit right there is what I was sort of getting at, because depending on how you answer that question, whoever falls on the outside changes. So if we're a primarily Arab people, for example, well, then the Kurd loses. Right.
Right. Except in an Ottoman context, there's a lot of ambiguity here, because, of course, in an Ottoman context, you have one sovereign that claims that everyone is Ottoman, and so you could be Kurdish and Kurdish and Ottoman, and you could be Arab and Ottoman. You could be. You see what I'm saying? So there's a lot of ambiguity, because the Arabs didn't have, of course, independence or their own sovereignty at this point.
The exploring this content at this time has been a very humbling experience, because the truth is that the lines are very muddy.
They were.
I'm currently reading Bashir Nafi's Arabism, Islamism, and the Palestine Question. Maybe I got the order of the title wrong.
Yeah.
But the line between, even in the interwar period, of who is an Arabist and who is an Islamist is very blurry. And even
Correct.
as I kind of read it again, and you could perhaps tell me if I've applied a good enough tool here, but I've sort of considered it a matter of a spectrum, where some people were slightly more secular, but were more, Unitarian in their view of putting together the Ottoman puzzle kind of back together. Some people were more religious, but independence figures. And some people were the opposite of those things. So they were both independent and secular. And they just kind of, on this matrix between independence, unity, secularism, and Islamism, all floated on these very, very muddy and gray boundaries.
Well, and also you could add minoritarianism, and you could also add, there's a whole other realm you could also add to that. Yes, it is an extremely, the whole point is that it's an extraordinarily complex landscape in the late 19th, early 20th century. And what we're talking about, of course, is an Ottoman Empire that is, on the one hand, in military decline at one level. On the other hand, it also is opening a space, especially in the Arab East, for these new identities to emerge and these questions and debates. And that's why we locate the Nahda, or the Arab Renaissance, in this Ottoman period. And we often think of it now after the Ottomans as an Arab Nahda, but of course it's in an Ottoman context that it's taking place. So that's important to bear in mind. The other thing to bear in mind is that in the Arab East, unlike the Balkans, we did not have until, in fact, we didn't have until the very end of the Ottoman Empire, we didn't have ethno-religious nationalisms in the Arab East. In other words, that's actually one of the most distinctive aspects of the ecumenical frame. That, in other words, the Ottoman impulse to transform from an empire of difference to an empire of citizens was actually actualized to a large extent in the Arab East in a way that it wasn't or couldn't be in the Balkans and in Anatolia, because there you had massive ethno-religious nationalist conflicts, which are not ancient, of course. These are very modern conflicts, but that sort of put paid to the idea of a revitalized Ottoman modern ecumenical sort of culture. That, you see what I'm saying? So there's no nationalism in the Mashriq as much as there was in the Balkans.
I completely understand what you're saying, and we started off the conversation speaking about the kind of cultural despair that we find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm.
But it almost seems like by the late 19th, early 20th century, you almost had. I'll tell you, the sense that I get is precisely the opposite. To borrow from Rashid Khalidi says in Palestinian Identity, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he talks about the early 20th century in Palestine, and he says that the future seemed pregnant with possibilities, most of them positive.
Yeah, of course. That's all. That's why we call it a Nahda, a renaissance. The whole point is that this was a moment where you had sort of cities were thriving, schools were being opened up. The Ottoman state was sort of expanding, despite its military decline vis-a-vis Europe. It was still nevertheless expanding the possibilities of what it meant to be Ottoman. Schools, theaters, I mean, the urbanization. There was a massive increase in all these aspects in the Ottoman Empire. So it was precisely this idea that people had it within their power to change their world for the better.
Yeah.
So I think that's really an important aspect, as opposed to today, where we live in the shadow of unrelenting cynicism and despair, because the situation in the Arab East today is so desperate. You have, on the one hand, the aftermath of the U.S. invasion, not just of Iraq, of course, but the destruction of secular Arab nationalism. You have the various despotic states. You have, of course, the Israeli brutalization of the Palestinians and colonization of the Palestinians, and you have 1,000 other issues besides: the collapse of Lebanon, the crushing of democracy in Syria and in Egypt, and so on and so forth. I mean, yeah, the situation is very different today. The geopolitics today has completely. I mean, there was, of course, geopolitics in the 19th century, but my point is, in the 19th century, and into the 20th century, in the Arab East, the geopolitics allowed for the possibilities of imagining a new future in a way that today it's about sort of shutting down people's imagination.
And these ideas, this project, and this is one of the things that I talk about in the podcast, they never, from the time that the ideas made contact with oxygen, from the time that they were always under unrelenting colonial pressure, right?
100%.
There was never a moment where the Ottoman Empire kind of got to take a step back and say,
no, not at all.
Collect ourselves.
100%. But you could respond to colonialism in different ways.
Right.
You can engage with colonialism in very different ways. You could, as some of the CUP sort of leaders did, you could sort of, in the end, respond to European imperialism by becoming extraordinarily brutal towards your own population, the Armenians, and the Armenian genocide, culminating in the Armenian genocide. But you could also respond as many Arab subjects did in the 19th century and 20th century, beginning with Boutros al-Bustani, but going all the way through to the end by trying to elaborate what it means to be a modern sort of civilized, quote unquote, civilized subject and citizen. And how do we do it? By bringing together Muslims and Christians, or Muslims and non-Muslims in a common sort of sphere. You see what I'm saying? A new idea of what it means to be civilized. That's also one response to European sort of intrusion.
I want to ask you about you mentioned Boutros al-Bustani, and I want to ask you about 1860, because the violence of 1860 is something that you describe as a watershed moment in the history of the Mashriq. Tell me about tell us more about this event and about the Nahda that it created. And was it understood as a watershed moment in its time?
Okay, well, it depends on, of course, again, historian is always going to tell you it depends on who and who we're talking about specifically. Okay. But there's more than one event, remember, in 1860. There's a set of events that takes place in Lebanon, in what we today call Lebanon, Mount Lebanon, where basically Maronite Christians and Druze are involved in what is essentially a civil war between them, or at least a conflict between them, which culminates in massacres. The Maronites get defeated in a certain part of Mount Lebanon, and they're massacred by Druze fighters. And then there is in July, and this is in sort of June of 1860, and then July of 1860, there's a massacre of Christians in Damascus, and it's the largest single massacre of Christians that takes place in the entirety of the Ottoman period in Syria. And yet in this massacre, which European missionaries, European consuls, the European press, including Karl Marx, by the way, and many others wrote about. It sort of captured the imagination of Europeans as an example of Muslim barbarism and Islamic savagery in their view, of course. Never mind the fact that the United States was involved in there were race riots in the United States, and there were the Europeans had brutalized different parts of the world, the French in Algeria, the British in India, and so on and so forth. Never mind all that, but there was in their view, this was a particular sort of indictment of Islam and of Muslim civilization, and they sensationalized this and they orientalized this, but they also responded to this. They sent a commission of inquiry to the region. The French even sent an army and compelled the Ottomans to accept, at least for a temporary basis, a French army in the Levant. And they joined the Ottoman state in sort of a commission of inquiry or an investigative committee to find out what happened and then to judge the perpetrators. And so this was considered by the Ottomans to be a moment of truth, in the sense that they had to prove that they were modern and civilized and the equals of the Europeans by judging those who had, in their view, embarrassed the empire and defamed the empire and defamed Islam. My point is that it was a huge sort of event, a major crisis, an Eastern question crisis. And the question for people on the ground was, well, how do you respond to this, these terrible scenes in Damascus as well as in Mount Lebanon? Do you become, and it's sort of in a sense, it's exactly like today. There's a parallel to what's happening. It's not exactly like today, but there's a parallel to what's happening today in places like Iraq and Syria. Do you respond to sectarian massacres and antagonism by becoming more sectarian, by saying this is it, and we have to defend ourselves, and we have to do whatever is necessary to protect ourselves? Or do you say, okay, this is a moment of truth, and we need to transcend this, and we need to build a common culture so that these kinds of events never occur again? And Bustani, who was himself Maronite originally, a Maronite Christian, who was in Beirut during the times of the massacres, and nothing happened in Beirut itself, although there was an influx of refugees. Bustani, who was had been a Maronite, had converted to American evangelical Protestantism, was profoundly affected by this and realized right away that there was an absolute and urgent need to, what he said, to awaken the people of Syria. And by the people of Syria, he meant all the peoples, like all the religions of Syria. And by Syria, it's not Syria as in the modern state of Syria, but the region of Syria, which includes, of course, Lebanon today, and sort of to basically awaken them to the reality of their heritage and their history and their history of coexistence, and to spark that again. How to do that? By building a new school, what he called a national school. And so, in other words, for Bustani, the idea was the way to respond to this is not to become embittered, but in fact to transcend our sort of human sort of failings and our sectarian passions, rise above that and build a common future, build a national culture based on the idea that the state and the nation belongs to all. So each community, each religion would contribute a building block to this sort of much larger nation that's multi-religious in Bustani's view. So he opens up a school, a famous school, after the massacres, precisely because he realized that there were people who were going to become more sectarian. Got it.
Now, one of the things that you describe actually in both of your books is the fact that Mount Lebanon, contrary to kind of our current projection of the past, was not divided primarily on sectarian grounds, but was divided more, if I've understood your work correctly, on a type of class basis, where the notables of Mount Lebanon, be they Druze or Maronite or Sunni or Shia or any other, whatever their sectarian complexion, all negotiated with one another, interacted with one another, and they all had their patrons, their clients, people, peasants, the Awam who depended on them. And Butros al-Bustani was very much part of that system. And in his envisioning of the ecumenical frame, he didn't really desire to overturn that. Now, did he?
Well, I mean, again, that's a complex question, and it's not that he didn't. Bustani was not a revolutionary in the sense of being a militant activist revolutionary, and he's often accused, as you mentioned earlier, he's often accused of being "quote unquote" an elitist. But if you think about what his actual sort of school and the pedagogy of the school, this national school, and remember, this school was recognized, and the Ottomans rewarded him for his work, his pedagogical, and of course his literary work. So he was recognized by the Ottoman state as an embodiment, at least in theory, an embodiment of this ideal type modern Ottoman subject citizen. And so what happens with Bustani is that he certainly was not sort of what we would call a militant, as I said, but he was radical in what he was proposing. The idea, because of course he's at this juncture as the empire is shifting from an empire of difference, of Islamic hegemony, basically, towards an empire of citizens. He's proposing a model of saying, okay, this is how we achieve this. And the way we achieve this is by creating a nation where each religious community is safe unto itself, should be respected for what it is. So in this sense, he's actually breaking also with the missionaries themselves, who of course, their idea was that everyone should become an American Protestant,
right?
Or some version thereof, to the best of their abilities and capacities. Because remember, they were always being judged by the missionaries as being deficient, culturally inferior. And Bustani didn't have any of this. Bustani said, no, I don't want that American vision. That's not appropriate. Doesn't make sense in our part of the world. But what does make sense is building a modern, multicultural, multi-religious nation, a modern, multi-religious nation where we very clearly separate the state, the secular state on the one hand, from people's private faiths. So in that sense, there's something quite radical about that. Now, again, he wasn't saying we should overthrow the social order, but of course, what he's proposing is the education of people, of boys, and eventually girls as well. So he's proposing the education of people, and in that sense, there's something quite interesting about his project, and quite radical, even though he wasn't a radical in the sense of advocating revolution.
You said something interesting a moment ago, and it actually reminds me of a question that I posed to Professor Michael Provence about what was the ideal Ottoman that the Ottomans had envisioned to emerge from the Tanzimat. And in a way, I guess what you're saying is that Bustani was, in a sense, what they were hoping to get out of, at least.
Well, in one sense, in the sense that Bustani wasn't advocating separating from the Ottoman state. He was sort of, paying homage and respect to the Ottoman state. So in that sense, he also wasn't a revolutionary at all. Right. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that's what the Ottomans sort of wanted as such as their primary goal. Remember, as I said in the book, the Tanzimat has two aspects to it. One aspect is sovereignty. The whole reason and the imperative for reform is that the Ottomans were desperate to maintain the territorial integrity and the political integrity of their state. And so that was first and foremost the goal, the imperative, the priority Reformation, the non-discrimination and equality of citizens and the elaboration of modern citizenship is a secondary aspect. These are the two aspects of the empire.
Right.
So I would say that the protecting the sovereignty of the state and doing whatever was necessary ultimately to protect the sovereignty of the state, including doing some terrible, brutal things, obviously, in the name of protecting Ottoman sovereignty, that was the imperative, and then everything else is secondary. But in the Arab East, because the conditions, the geopolitical, the political, the social conditions were such, it allowed for that second aspect, the non-discrimination aspect, to emerge, and Bustani embodied that.
Yeah, by the time this airs, my listeners will have listened to 3 or 4 episodes of me trying to walk my listeners through the creation of a state, and a state, I define that as an institution that possesses a monopoly on violence. So the creation of a modern state.
That is a Weberian definition.
Yeah, it's my favorite.
Yeah.
So the creation of a state and the creation of a nation as a common story, and these two distinct things kind of coming.
But remember that's the ideal everywhere in the world. Every modern state has a similar kind of ideal, and nowhere is it sort of. And that's the other part of the book, by the way. The part that maybe we could talk about is that it's also addressed to readers to tell them, look, the American and European stories are not, in a sense, better than our story in our part. There is extraordinary contradiction in all parts of the world, including in the American and European aspects.
Michael Province took me to task on this, in fact, in our conversation, when he mentioned that we speak about education reform and things like that in the Ottoman period as if it wasn't happening elsewhere.
Exactly.
But in reality, these processes were happening everywhere, and everyone was in negotiation about what it means to be us and what it means to be them. I'm currently reading Salim Derengel's The Well-Protected Domains. And he does a fantastic job of articulating exactly this, that the Russians and the Japanese and the Germans were undergoing similar negotiations. Now,
except we're being colonized at the same time.
Yes, that unrelenting pressure that is happening at the same time, and there is something else that is different. I mean, there's a lot that's different.
Yeah, there's a lot.
But there's one important thing that I want to highlight in this conversation that's different, is that there is this dance between equality and tolerance that the Ottomans are renegotiating, that maybe was not present in other circumstances because their cultural basis was different. So you spend a lot of time on this, and I'll try to frame the question as succinctly as I can. So historian Karen Barkley, who you mentioned earlier, she kind of explains that the success or health of coexistence kind of ultimately depends on our expectation of future interactions. And I'm not even sure if she's the first person to mention this, but this is where I got it from. And she kind of says that communities can and will coexist peacefully if they believe that tomorrow will be as good or better than today. But in your account of the Mashriq in the Tanzimat era, it seems that the success of intercommunal life isn't the primary priority in applying the reforms. A much more central theme seems to be an exploration of how to get the European bear off of the back of the high port. And this is something that
for the Ottoman state, you mean?
For the Ottoman state, yes.
Yeah.
And this continues into the interwar period with the successor projects all the way through. So it's not really about what's best for us, but really, how do we get them to leave us alone?
No, it's actually both at the same time. I mean, that's the complexity. I mean, that's the whole point. The dialectic is that it's both at the same time, and that's the dialectic, and that's the promise and the tragedy of the Middle East, the modern Middle East. Remember, this is the last part of the world that's formally colonized by the Europeans after World War I, in the name of self-determination and religious freedom. The perversity of European colonial thought and Wilsonianism, for that matter. So the idea of colonizing in the name of self-determination. And so I think it's both this relentless European pressure that you've alluded to, this colonial pressure, that takes different forms and different guises, that itself is not static. It changes. So before World War One, the Europeans didn't colonize in the name of self-determination. They usually typically colonized or intruded or impinged upon the integrity of the Ottoman Empire in the name of protecting religious minorities or communities, whether they were Catholics or whether they were other communities, Orthodox in the case of the Russians. They would sort of intervene on behalf of these communities. After World War One, they intervened in the name of self-determination. Mm-hmm. And so even the Europeans, that's one kind of relentless, although dynamic impact. On the other hand, you also have, as you said, there's a sort of attempt to negotiate what all cultures and all cultures in the world are negotiating in this period, which is to say, how do we what does it mean to be civilized? What does it mean to be modern? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be a nation? And where do we draw the line between diversity or pluralism, we would say today, or diversity, we would say today, and sovereignty, and an effective sovereignty?
You're the guy who wrote the book, so I'm going to ask you a question that it's almost in the context of a modern liberal democracy is an almost blasphemous question to ask. But for the Mashriq, is a society that is predicated on equality fundamentally better than one that is predicated on tolerance?
Well, I mean, tolerance, of course, is again, tolerance. What kind of tolerance are we talking about? I don't see these as mutually exclusive. I mean, tolerance, pre-modern empires and early modern empires tolerated in the sense that they would accept for certain periods and in certain conditions what we would call religious pluralism in their empire. They tolerated various communities, which are not, by the way, only religious communities. They tolerated various ethnicities, various communities. In other words, they tolerated the multi-ethnic and multi-religious aspect of their empire, in part because they had no choice, and in part because they were completely okay with the idea of a multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire, so long as subjects were quiet. I mean, were subordinate mm-hmm. and paid their taxes, and were deferential in the necessary ways. And so mm-hmm. that's one form of tolerance. And then equality is this 19th century problem that emerges, not just in the Ottoman Empire, everywhere in the world it emerges. And right. As we know, the US grappled and still grapples profoundly with this question of equality. And the European empires, European states also grappled with it. Do you see what I'm saying? So my point is that there's this constant interplay between tolerating something and equality. I mean, there's a difference.
I completely and I need to disclose you've lived in my head rent free since I've read your I've read your book. And one of the things that the negative externality of equality is sameness, right? Is a pressure to get people to kind of conform to a particular standard.
But not necessarily sameness. That's what makes the Mashriq so interesting and the ecumenical frame so interesting. It's equality and difference. Mm-hmm. It's equality and profound religious difference. There is no attempt or pretense that everyone is the same. There's no pretense that Christmas and Ramadan are the same. Right. You respect the difference of each tradition. Mm-hmm. And of course, the question is then, how do you interpret each tradition? And the issue I have with what the earlier quotation you were talking about, Karen Barkey, is that our part of the world is not just communities. There are communities, so there are also individuals. There's also dissent within communities. Right. I mean, communities themselves are diverse. And so we often talk about Sunnis and Shias and everyone else as if these are like homogenous groups that don't change and have no internal sort of diversity. And they do.
Or debate and dialogue.
Yeah, or debate and dialogue. And so my point is, let's open the questions rather than sort of preclude a whole line of questions.
Yeah, and you describe in Artillery of Heaven, you describe As'ad Shidyaq as the ultimate victim of tolerance. Like the Ottomans were so tolerant of the Maronites that they let him they let the church torture him to death, essentially.
Well, they didn't. They I think they barely knew about him. They barely recognized this at all. They didn't. It was, whatever. This is out in the margins of imperial imagination. They were just not fundamentally interested in this kind of story.
I have one more question for you here.
Sure.
But it's a but it's a big one. So I've spent, I don't know, the last 2 years or so just hyper focused on Ottoman Palestine and the late Ottoman Empire.
Sure.
And I've seen the way that our understanding of the present has sort of polluted our understanding of the past. And two of the conclusions that I've slowly formed, or that are kind of forming in my imagination, is the first: the mid to late Ottoman Empire was not the theocracy that is the dream of some, or that is a nightmare of others. But the other is that the social and political and territorial arrangements of that same era were, in almost every sense, so far as I could tell, objectively better than the post-war arrangements that were imposed upon the post-war Mashriq. So,
well, I mean, yeah, because what's your question? So
so first of all, do you agree with this this characterization that, firstly, that the Ottoman Empire, we have a poor understanding of the Ottoman past because there was no single project, and you talk about this in the book. There was no single state that totally inherited the Ottoman project. In fact, for both the Arabs and the Turks, there was a selective remembrance and a selective forgetting of what the Ottoman past was. But do you agree then that whatever we have now, what we've been working with after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, whether we like to admit it or not, is substantially more inhibiting than what we were trying to work with in the context of the Ottoman universe that we were all a part of? And by we, I mean the people of the Mashriq.
The Mashriq, I mean, that's a difficult question in the sense that it's an interesting question. It's a fascinating question. You know, on the one hand, you could say, yes, of course, they were, I mean, they were better off at one level in the sense that there was an Ottoman territorial and sovereign whole. But the point is that it didn't have to be worse in the post-Ottoman period. The question is, why did it become so bleak, and when? Mm-hmm. It wasn't necessarily so bleak in the 1920s and 1930s, although, I mean, there was obviously European colonialism at that point. What happens is that the European will to partition, talk about the relentless sectarian drive on the part of the British and the French to divide up this region. Mm-hmm. To divide up the region, not because people in the region were asking for division, but because, of course, it suited their imperial interests. The classic story of divide and rule. And then, of course, the whole story of Zionism in Palestine, which I talk about a lot in the book, this colonial Zionism in Palestine, and the destruction of the possibility of being an Arab Jew. This is a fundamental part as well of the story that I talk about. And so all these things coming together, and then, of course, you have oil, and then you have the U.S. sort of relationship to the region, which is primarily based on the obsession with oil and the extraction and sort of the domination of the oil resources of the region, the support for Israel despite of what it meant for Palestinians and Arabs, and then the support of dictatorships, pro-American dictatorships, wherever they may be in the region. So this architecture of hegemony, of course, is bleak and has sort of led to the catastrophe that we're living today. I mean, there's no doubt about that in my view, as a historian, as a scholar, as someone who knows this region, who comes from this region. There's no question. But the question was that inevitable? Mm-hmm. In other words, I think the juxtaposition with the Ottomans is, I mean, if you're an Armenian living in the late Ottoman Empire, for example, you can't say it was better for you to be, because the late Ottoman Empire became extraordinarily brutal towards various communities in the name of nationalism. The question is, why did the Europeans partition this part of the world? Why did it sort of, look at the irony, the perverse irony that this is the Mashriq was the one part of the world, I make this point over and over again because I really believe it, the one part of the world where the question of Muslim and non-Muslim, especially Muslim-Christian coexistence, was most advanced, most elaborated, most thought about, far more than in the West, frankly, far more than in other parts of the world. And yet it's the one part of the world where the Europeans come in and deliberately divide up everyone along sectarian lines. Mm-hmm. I mean, and so that has those have that imperial sort of will the extraordinary negative energy and the geopolitics that entailed have had massive consequences, beginning with the question of Palestine, but also the question of Syria, also the question of Lebanon, and of course, ultimately the question of Iraq today.
One of the things that always just kind of knocks me back in my seat is thinking about how up until the kind of mass industrialization that came with the Tanzimat and the Hamidian era, it took something like 3 months to travel from Baghdad to Damascus.
Correct.
But in a way, that journey was more conceivable than the 8-hour flight that it would take now. I imagine that in some ways there are more barriers. Although
that's not because plane travel is what you're alluding to. Right. Travel by air is somehow worse than travel by whatever. The question is why. Yeah. I mean, the irony is that our means of communication today are vastly superior to what was there before, in terms of efficiency, in terms of ability, in terms of ease, and yet the barriers, the political barriers, the mental barriers today, but there's been, I mean, I don't know how to say this, but there's been a project, and someone should write about this, a project to devastate, to colonize and recolonize and constantly the consciousness of people in the modern Arab East, to diminish their ability to think about their past and their future, of course, by endlessly focusing on the present, overwhelming people so that they don't even have the option of thinking about, okay, what is it about our past that we can draw from? Mm-hmm. What threads of the past can we draw on to rebuild an emancipated future?
Just on this last note here, this is one of the things that, my podcast is primarily about the Palestinian experience, and this is where I do most of my research. Mm-hmm. And that there is not just because of the Nakba, but even leading up to that was an annihilation of exactly what you just referred to, which is the immediate Palestinian past. So there's...
You mean after the Nakba?
No, even actually before that there was this effort to forget that immediate Ottoman past. Lawrence has in 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he says something to the effect of the Arabs believe in people, not in institutions. But this is buffoonery, right? The Ottomans had very complex institutions.
Lawrence is just like a crass imperial agent, right? Lionized in the West and nowhere else.
And so there's all these institutions that the Palestinians, leading up to the Nakba, and of course dramatically after the Nakba, have been totally separated from. So there's hundreds of years of Ottoman knowledge, not Turkish knowledge, but Ottoman knowledge that they have no access to. That is just
but you could say the same. I mean, you to a large extent you're right, of course, but you could say the same about Lebanon and Syria and many other places as well. Mm-hmm. There's been a deliberate attempt to forget the Ottoman past. Right. But that's in part also because of not in part, that's in large part because of what happened after World War I.
Right.
Both the Kemalist project, which also sort of, reinterprets what it means to be Turkish, and sort of and dissociates from the Ottoman past and of course from the Arabs, and the Arabs in turn under European colonialism dissociate from the Ottoman past as well. And so we don't learn, of course, Ottoman history in any significant way in the Middle East today. And we don't actually learn what was actually an extraordinarily complex period with negatives and positives. But the point is to at least appreciate that is part of our history as opposed to something alien.
Professor Makdisi, I've taken way more of your time than I had initially negotiated, and I appreciate it. Before you go, what are you working on now? Which must be like the most, as an academic, like that you've just poured years of your life into this book. So now that's in the past. What's next?
What's next is going to be a project that I'm working on now that begins with the King Crane Commission of 1919, which is this American, an American commission of inquiry that was sent to the Mashriq, and then use that as a point of departure to talk about the sort of the themes that we've been talking about, this last colonialism, and the implications of this last colonialism in terms of its relationship. Like, how did this last colonialism and this sort of active will of Western domination change and interact with the issues of pluralism in the modern Arab world?
I can't wait. Is there, I've bombarded you with questions. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you wish I had?
No, not really. I mean, honestly, no. I mean, I'm open to any questions. So ask away.
No, then that's great. I want to thank you again for your time, and I hope we can keep in touch, and I hope that we can keep you back as my podcast progresses and I move chronologically, progressively toward the present. I hope that we can have a few more of these conversations.
I'm looking forward to them.
Dr. Makdisi, thank you so much, and bye for now.
Take care, Bassem. Bye-bye.